Thank you. Mr. Allen.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the Commission today. I'm here as the president of the U.S.-China Business Council, a private, nonpartisan, non-profit organization of approximately 220 American companies across all industry sectors that do business in China, including the healthcare sector. Also, as noted, a former U.S. ambassador and a trade negotiator with the Department of Commerce, where I led the discussions to improve China's market access for medical devices and pharmaceuticals. I've dedicated many, many years to increasing American jobs through bolstering our export sector. It is my belief that America remains among the most innovative nations because we cultivate the free flow of ideas, information, and people, and we engage in a deliberative process that encourages and respects different opinions in order to arrive at decisions that benefit the greatest good. As the Commission considers the relationship between the U.S. and Chinese life sciences sectors, I'd like to highlight three main principles that underlie my recommendations. First, U.S. investments in China benefit the U.S. economy. U.S. companies have benefited greatly from the growth opportunities a rising China has provided, mostly through rapidly growing exports. It's important to note that most U.S. companies invest in China to access and serve China's domestic market, but the revenue that they generate in China is also a driver of growth and innovation in the United States. So in 2015, our latest numbers, U.S. exports to China directly and indirectly supported 1.8 million jobs in the United States. If the economic benefits generated from U.S. investment in China and Chinese investment in the U.S. are combined, the total jumps to 2.6 million American jobs. The healthcare sector is an important part of this story. U.S. exports of pharmaceuticals to China reached nearly $3 billion in 2018, and the biopharmaceutical industry supports 4.7 million U.S. jobs. The medical device industry supports 2 million U.S. jobs. China has become the world's second largest market for pharmaceuticals and fourth largest market for medical equipment, and this market is growing rapidly as China ages. It is increasingly important that U.S. companies continue to participate in this space to support U.S. job creation. My second principle is that commercial challenges are best addressed through engagement. It's my experience that Chinese healthcare regulators are properly focused on safety and efficacy, and they want to learn from us and with us. Nonetheless, while U.S. health companies see tremendous opportunities in China, there are remaining market access barriers that affect our companies' ability to equally compete, as Dr. Huang has indicated. The majority of these challenges are highly technical in nature and unique to the healthcare industry, and they would include 1, regulatory approval delays, 2, pricing and reimbursement controls, and 3, insufficiently effective intellectual property right protection and implementation. The U.S. government cannot arrive at the most effective and sustainable approaches to resolving these very important trade issues if private sector industry stakeholders and experts are not closely consulted. The most effective and sustainable way to resolve specific commercial issues is through regular dialogue between key U.S. and Chinese government and industry stakeholders. Technical commercial issues and barriers to trade require regular, precise, and technical discussions. Also, international fora provide critical opportunities to leverage our bilateral negotiations. We must continue to use multilateral institutions to encourage China to adopt international best practices and standards which will indirectly support U.S. exports. My third principle is that bilateral dialogue makes us stronger. The Chinese government has strong incentives to improve basic health care and expand access to innovative treatments for China's growing and rapidly aging population. And these are goals that U.S. companies are very well positioned to support. There are mutually beneficial solutions to be had by reducing technical barriers to trade through cooperation and engagement. But we need to communicate regularly to compare best practices, and ideally, we need to build on a foundation of respect, trust, and collaboration. So for recommendations, I would submit to you 4 ideas. Firstly, we need to leverage all available tools for engagement. The government should seek to engage China through bilateral, regional, and multilateral forums to help foster improvements in China's regulatory environment. We need to get back to platforms such as the JCCT and the SNED to regularly discuss these technical issues and encourage the Chinese government to return to stalled healthcare reforms and find mutually agreeable solutions which will improve healthcare and safety and will also help to expand U.S. exports. Secondly, in these consultations, please continue to involve private sector industry experts in the technical policy dialogues. It is essential that highly technical, nuanced health sector issues are systemically addressed through targeted policy discussions, not only between governments in consultation with industry, but also with technical experts as well. Thirdly, please strongly support missions like USTDA and FTA. And the FDA. Those organizations deserve continued financial support. And then finally, we must narrowly and precisely define emerging technologies and foundational technologies as additional export controls are rolled out. It is imperative that our export control policies do not unduly limit innovation in American exports if the ultimate goal is to maintain U.S. leadership, particularly in advanced sectors. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Thank all of you for your timeliness of your testimony. Commissioner Cleveland. Thank you all. I'm struck somewhat by the discussion today and on this panel, and Mr. Allen understanding all your points about engagement, et cetera, and appreciate that. But the core issue we're talking about here is the safety of the products we're importing. That's not a question of fair or unfair. It's a question of life or death. And I don't mean that to, to besmirch you in any way. I don't understand why our desire to have a regulatory system in China, our desire to potentially block imports of APIs or anything else, if they can't be validated as safe, should be viewed as an unfair approach by China. And I'm not saying you said that, but that's sort of what I'm feeling, that, if we're asking them to be up to world-class standards, we're not doing that for a protectionist issue. We're doing that for health and safety for our people. That is protection. Protecting their health and safety, yes, but not protecting market share or, or businesses or et cetera. Can you help me in terms of how the Chinese view this?
Sure.
Do they view us as being unfair?
Thank you, Commissioner. So my approach to this subject for the last 25 years has been as a process of trying to promote exports. One of the key factors there has been the US FDA trying to increase standards across the board. From 25 years ago, they started out with good manufacturing practices and then good clinical practices. And they've really done yeoman's work to try and increase standards across the board. I think it's, and that process benefits U.S. consumers, obviously, as well as Chinese consumers. There has been a virtuous cycle of consultation between the FDA, the Department of Commerce, and USTR for many, many years, so as to try and improve standards for all, up to U.S. standards or global standards. The higher Chinese standards are, the better it is for American companies and American exporters. So there is a commonality of interest here with Chinese regulators who wish to advocate for and to ensure the safety for Chinese consumers along with us. I would also note that because of the doubts of Chinese drug and consumer medical device products, therefore, foreign and particularly American companies have a very high reputation for quality. And thus our market there is very strong and has been strong for a long time. So I would posit with you that there has been a virtuous cycle over many years. That cycle has at least temporarily stopped. I would argue that it is in our interest to renew that cycle and to engage in with the Chinese regulators and American companies to address many of, or some of the failings within Chinese manufacturing and the Chinese regulatory space. The Chinese regulators face terrible problems in trying to regulate their own country, and the FDA has helped them to do that, benefiting not only them, but benefiting all of us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks to our witnesses for a really interesting panel. I have so many questions. I'm not going to be able to ask all of them, at least in this round. But very quickly first, Ms. Eben, do the FDA inspectors that are on the ground have Chinese language skills?
So you've touched on a huge issue, and in fact, because it was only 7 minutes, I couldn't get into it. I do in my testimony. Mostly they don't. And often the translators are provided by the companies that they're inspecting, and they're company salesmen. And I was even able to document instances where there are just wild deceptions because of that. So sometimes Chinese companies will pool resources and pay for one show factory that looks like, you know, out of central casting. And because the FDA investigators can't even read the street signs, they're each inspecting the same facility, but they think it's 4 different companies. So, I mean, it's really, the language barrier has created an opportunity for really wild deceit.
I guess for all of you, I'm really trying to, thank you first, but I'm trying to understand how the Chinese got to the point that they are the lowest cost producer on these things, right? I mean, it's really rather stunning that they can produce at a lower cost than India. So government subsidies, I mean, what is the pattern that has allowed them to be able to produce at the lowest cost?
In my reporting, I sort of traced the rise of China as the leading manufacturer of antibiotics, which was really sort of the rise of China in the pharmaceutical space. Part of that was because of very lax environmental regulations, and these pharmaceutical plants create a lot of pollution, but also because they had hundreds of years of expertise in fermentation with soy sauce. And there's fermentation processes in the making of antibiotics. So that was sort of like opening the door to them as a go-to producer of very, very cheap pharmaceuticals, and it went on from there.
So, Mr. Allen?
Chairman, I would note that you see similar patterns throughout all of the chemical industries, all from petrochemical to fine chemical to dyes for textiles. China would probably be the low-cost producer around the world. I think nothing nefarious there. Rather, it has to do with the cost of capital being relatively low and very large economies of scale, as well as a entrepreneurial culture, universities that are just pouring out engineers. China, as I understand, will graduate 1.8 million engineers this year and years into the future. So it's not unnatural that China would have a very large industry here, and nor that they would be the low-cost producer. This is if I may, this is an intensely political issue, quality of drugs and quality of healthcare in China. And from the premier down, there is a mandate to improve quality and improve safety and improve efficacy. As recently as 2 months ago, the premier himself spoke about the demand of the Chinese people for quality health care and also education and environment and food. So this is something that the Chinese leadership is intently focused on and wishing to improve.
When they find out, as you just said, with the meetings that you've been at, do they do anything to the companies that are violating what they want?
So there are many different types of problems that the SFDA or the Chinese regulators face. Corruption is one. Their ability to get out to the factories is another one. The subcontracting is a third type of problem. I would note to you, however, that at least on the corruption side, that if Chinese regulators of pharmaceuticals are found to be corrupt, it's a bullet in the head as punishment. It's very severe. So that is indicative of the importance to which the Chinese government looks at this issue. And that has not resolved the problems yet. But I think it is probably inaccurate to suggest that the officials responsible for safety and efficacy are not trying to address this issue.
The title of this panel is U.S.-China Links in Health and Medical Products, Risk and Opportunities. We spent a fair amount of time talking about risks. Ambassador Allen, you inserted a sentence at the very end of your answer to my last question about the opportunities for American pharmaceutical companies in China. Can you elaborate a little bit? What are you hearing from your member companies going
Yeah,
forward?
thank you very much for the opportunity. China's 20% of the world's population. They're facing a terrible demographic problem, especially exacerbated by the one-child policy, and thus their demand for high-quality pharmaceuticals is growing very rapidly, well above global growth rates. We have done very well in that market, and we will continue to do well, provided the bilateral overall relationship remains stable. It is a matter of fact that Chinese patients who are able to obtain foreign pharmaceuticals or medical devices will prefer them. And this offers a tremendous opportunity. Moreover, it is a matter of fact that a large percentage of global engineers that will contribute in this industry are coming from China and are Chinese, and they will be innovating in the future, and our companies are wishing to work with them, to grow global businesses with them. It is a fact that our pharmaceutical industries are quite well integrated, they are synergistic, and they are interdependent, and the future of American pharmacy has is at least to some extent predicated on the ability to be able to serve Chinese customers and to sell into that market. And anything that reduces our ability to take advantage of a very large pharmaceutical market will have an unintended consequence on the productivity and on the competitiveness and on the profitability of American pharmaceutical firms. So we should be very careful as we regulate, so as not to as to avoid unnecessary negative and unintended negative consequences.